Good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending on where y'all are coming to us from. We are going to give folks a couple of minutes to join us, trickle in, and then we will get started. Again, for those just joining, we're going to give it another minute or two to give folks a couple minutes to join, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, welcome everyone to the second in our Spotlight on the Foster System webinar series. This one is called Policing by Another Name, Mandated Reporting as State Surveillance. A quick administrative note that we will have a Q&A portion at the end, so feel free to submit questions in that function on Zoom. We will have our chat disabled, but encourage you instead to follow along and engage in the discussion on Twitter or other social media with the hashtag on your screen. My name is Tanya Gassenheimer. I'm an attorney at the Shriver Center, where we fight for economic and racial justice through advocacy tools like shaping policy. I work on the community justice team, where we focus on the criminal, legal, and foster systems with the goal of keeping families together, out of systems, and in their communities. Today, we'll be talking about mandated reporting, so we can start with what that even is. And it's a set of laws and rules requiring that individuals make reports to their respective states when they suspect a child has been neglected or abused. And we will discuss throughout what that suspicion means, the lack of guidance or clarity on what it means even to have that suspicion. And of course, a major question is, does it work? And we have a lot of this information and statistics are from the Elephant Circle's great resource on mandated reporting. And these schemes cast a very wide net with the better safe than sorry mentality. But that mentality, unfortunately, is based on a lot of assumptions that we know from practice and research not to be true. So one of the assumptions is the accuracy of the system in preventing and stopping harm, when really only 59% of all reports even meet the bare threshold to be investigated, which begs the question of why are so many calls being made? Even of those that are investigated, a little over 16% even end up substantiated, meaning there's any cause for concern to proceed. And so of the total calls, only 9% end in substantiated investigations. And of those 9%, only 6% are for neglect, which more often than not is attributable to poverty, inadequate food, shelter, clothing. Those are things that should be met with resources and support rather than punitive systemic intervention. Another assumption is that punishing individuals will heal the harms caused, when we've seen time and time again that children do better when they're at home, and that mandated reporting does not decrease harm, but actually instead undermines the efficacy of support services because folks are less likely to trust services that have these strings attached, that are not just freestanding support. Another main assumption is that the system's responses and even the system's mistakes themselves don't cause harm, when we know actually that system involvement, regardless of the accuracy in identifying harm, causes, exacerbates, and perpetuates harm and trauma on children, families, and communities. And we know that it's predominantly and disproportionately communities of color that are being impacted. And so going through a brief history, going back to the late 1800s into the early 1900s, it's important to remember the context historically, that we are fresh off of the Civil War, which was just fought over slavery. Indian boarding schools are happening when Indigenous children are forcibly removed from their homes and reservations, forced into schools to assimilate to whiteness. And the so-called orphan trains are happening at this time. When in 1874 in New York, animal cruelty laws were passed, which were the basis for the first child removal. And then a year later, the first in the globe, the first child abuse or child protective agency was created in New York. And there are excerpts here from the mission to rescue little children from neglect and abandonment and improper treatment, and to secure the prompt conviction and punishment of persons who ill-treat and neglect such children. And that shows two things. One, a very paternalistic view of rescuing and saviorism, with the overlay of the moral and value judgments of who can parent and who can't, what children are supposed to assimilate to and grow up to be, which is whiteness and white culture, and the immediate punitive carceral response like the criminal legal system, calling for conviction and punishment. In the early 1800s, the Children's Bureau, which is the federal agency over this arena, was created, and there was a wartime campaign in 1918 couching this call for child protection as a patriotic duty. Again, as a further overlay of these moral and value judgments, these racialized histories, now in the mechanism of patriotism. And then in 1935, the Social Security Act establishes federal funding for children's social services. Moving forward into the 1900s, in 1962 was the Battered Child Syndrome book that was published by Dr. Kempe, who created this diagnosis, which saw a shift in the medical community for this responsibility to report maltreatment or abuse. Victoria Copeland out of California has a great article in the imprint recently published, actually calling into question and calling for the questioning of academia and big data, and how some of these research studies that form so much of the foundation of our system's responses need to be questioned, because who was in the room when this research was conducted? It more often than not did not include impacted communities or voices, and it had this overlay of the moral and value judgments of the researchers. Then in 1963, the Children's Bureau created model statutes, which were then adopted by all 50 states in their own versions to have child abuse laws with these mandated reporting requirements, most often identifying social workers and educators as some of the main reporters. In 1974, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act codified that in order to get federal funding, so then the funding piece, which is always huge, states were required to have a mandated reporting law, which in Illinois is the Abused and Neglected Child Reporting Act. Moving along to the 1980s into the present, under Reagan, we saw the Children's Bureau creating resource centers to provide services to families, which is noteworthy because it was a shift to the public sector this responsibility for child protection and family dynamics. And Reagan's Attorney General directed prosecutors to charge and try cases of abuse, which was one of the first explicit acknowledgments of this carceral and punitive response and approach to child protection. And then in 1997, Clinton signed the Adoption and Safe Families Act, which many of you know, fast-tracked adoption timelines and prioritized permanency over family reunification or preservation, which was and continues to be highly problematic because it paints children remaining in their homes and children being permanently separated from their families as two sides of a neutral coin, which we know they are not. And then there have been ongoing efforts since then in Illinois and beyond to expand mandated reporting. By 2016, 18 states and Puerto Rico had defined all adults 18 plus as mandated reporters, regardless of profession or training. And it's important to note that oftentimes when a high profile tragedy happens that is covered by the media, there is a knee-jerk reaction to expand mandated reporting, to expand surveillance out of fear and out of the concern to prevent these tragedies from happening. But the largest problem there is that we have seen time and time again that these knee-jerk reactions don't actually prevent these tragedies or prevent these harms from happening. And all they do is actually expand the number of folks brought into the system. So it expands the harm to more families and to more communities. And so a snapshot here from Cook County, I'm coming to you from Chicago and Illinois more broadly. This is a non-exhaustive list of mandated reporters, just to show just how expansive this is. We're talking about medical personnel, social services, social workers, substance abuse counselors, folks in schools, law enforcement, and it's important to think about here too that not only healthcare and school where most folks are going, anywhere that folks are going for support. So agency staff at places where folks enroll in food stamps or Medicaid, places where substance use treatment programs, where folks are going for support. Again, it's this idea of support having strings attached and not just being support. And back to what I mentioned about the suspicion of abuse or neglect, what does that even mean? There's no mention of cultural competency or implicit bias in a lot of these training materials. There are also so many professions represented, so there's no standardization across professions of what mandated reporting means, what we are telling the actual reporters, what that duty entails. And this is not even to consider the folks in jurisdictions where anyone 18 and over is a mandated reporter. So what that translates to is much of what goes into a report comes down to individuals' implicit and explicit biases, which can be cultural, judgments on what parents feed their children or have in the home, parenting styles, discipline styles, ways of speaking to children. And then, of course, there's the common conflation of poverty with neglect. Again, diapers, childcare, these are things that should not be met with punitive harms or systemic intervention. They should be met with unadulterated support or resources. And these are a couple of pull quotes, things that colleagues of mine and I have actually heard mandated reporters saying about the communities they serve, which is just an indication, a small example of many, of the very problematic nature of what is going into these reports. Here in Cook County, this is data from 2012 to 2018, and you see that when you sum up these numbers, 70 to 80% of hotline calls are coming from a combination of the criminal legal system and supportive services. We know the criminal legal system disproportionately surveils and targets communities of color, particularly Black communities. And then for supportive services, again, it's services that have these very problematic strings attached through education, health and mental health, social services. So folks going to places where they're getting or needing life-sustaining treatment or care, they face the fear and threat of family separation. And so far I've been talking a lot about what goes into the call and before the call. And one of the issues there is that a lot of the thought process or thinking has to do with what professions are telling their employees, their staff to do, threatening their licenses, this fear of repercussion, when what's missing from that conversation is the actual harm of what happens after the call. And this is an example from Illinois, that this call, it's not a better safe than sorry. This is not a neutral event, that no harm done if it ends up not being a cause for concern. It's really a very harmful occurrence and process, a longstanding process. So if DCFS here chooses to investigate, an investigator will show up within 24 hours. And while this procedure very much parallels a criminal legal system, one place where it does not is the minimal protections that the criminal legal system has. So there's no Miranda warning here. There's no right to assigned counsel. There's no right to silence. And so parents are, what they do say or don't say, and what they do or don't do, all of that is under scrutiny and can and will be used against them if and when this case goes to court, at which point it will be an individual parent's word against the state agency, against the state's attorney, against the weight of the power of the state. And then this investigation can go on for the DCFS, and potentially the police have 60 days. And there are so many additional traumas layered on to the initial call or knowing that you're being investigated. There is the continual threat of child removal and sometimes actual removal during the investigation itself through protective custody, which DCFS has discretion to take, or through safety plans. There is a trauma of intrusion, searching your home, having your parenting capacity questioned, having your child potentially strip searched, and having your child potentially interviewed outside of your presence or even in your presence. And then if DCFS decides to indicate or substantiate a case, they can request the state's attorney bring that case, which can trigger a much longer court process that can last for multiple years. So this is just a glimpse to show that we really need to question and unearth some of these issues with the floods of these calls, when after the call can involve so much harm that lasts multiple lifetimes and through generations. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over to our moderator, who is Shriver Center is proud to have her as our first social work intern. She's been working exclusively in this foster system work. She is the main force behind the child welfare reading list. A lot of you hopefully have seen and have been sharing. And otherwise, she works at the Posse Foundation, working on college readiness with high school students preparing for college, and has generally spent much of her educational and professional career working with youth. So with that, take it away, Molly.
Thank you so much, Tanya. I am super excited to help shape today's space with our 4 incredible panelists who are joining us, and I would love to introduce them to everybody. So first we have Shrounda Selivanoff, who is the Director of Public Policy at the Children's Home Society of Washington. Shrounda is a passionate advocate for impacted parents, and it's driven by her own experience in the child welfare system navigation. She brings a birth parent's perspective to inform policy, practice, and system reform, and has done so throughout various organizations in Washington state, including as a founding member of the Birth Parent National Network, a member of the Washington State Racial Disproportionality Advisory Committee, an executive board member of Family Treatment Court of King County, and a parent stakeholder representative of the Department of Children, Youth, and Families Oversight Board. Also with us today is Charity Tolliver, founder and project director, of Black on Both Sides. Charity is a nationally recognized youth development specialist, foster mother, writer, spoken word artist, and former director of Southwest Youth Collaborative. Her multitude of campaign work has included many things, including fairer housing, labor rights, school reform, prison reform, and LGBT youth rights. Charity received the Soros Justice Fellowship in 2013 to found Black on Both Sides, an organization that centers the lives and stories of those most directly impacted by racist systems and institutions to bring long-term sustainable change to both the foster system and prison system. Next, we have Fallon Speaker, who is director of the Jeanette Lipman Family Law Clinic and assistant clinical professor of law at the University of Richmond School of Law. She is a feminist, a reproductive justice transformer, a social justice leader, and a movement lawyer. The clinic wherein she teaches works holistically with communities affected by child welfare and dependency proceedings in Richmond. Among other roles, Fallon has previously served as a staff attorney and team leader in the family defense practice at the Bronx Defenders, where she represented parents who were accused of abuse or neglect. She was integral to creating legislation to reform the New York child welfare system and the state central registry. And of course, we also have Elena Gormley, MSW student at the University of Illinois at Chicago Jane Addams School of Social Work. Elena is a writer, organizer, troublemaker, and current social work intern at Chicago Workers Collaborative. Prior to attending UIC, Elena worked in a variety of youth development and after-school programs, including the Boys and Girls Club and the YMCA, both in Michigan. As a future social worker, Elena is interested in abolishing the entire field of social work and supporting systems of care and support that are liberated from carceral systems of social control or gatekeeping. We want to remind folks before we begin with the questions that we will have some time toward the end of the conversation for panelists to respond to questions from the audience. Please continue to use the Q&A feature you see in the bottom menu bar of your screen to submit questions for consideration. So in this work, we think it's really important to be explicit and name and ground our conversation in parent and family perspective, because we believe they should always be at the center of these discussions and of the decision making around them. Children don't exist in a vacuum, right? They are part of these families and communities that are heavily impacted by DCFS and the foster system. So with that said, we just want to start by talking about how mandated reporters are actually viewed by impacted communities. Charity, would you like to start us off with this question?
Yes. I'm gonna do a prepared statement versus speaking. So I wanna answer this question with a quote first from Malcolm X, a former young person in the foster care system. Once said that when the welfare people come, it's akin to legal modern day slavery, however kindly intentioned. And I want to open with this quote because I too believe that the foster care system is akin to slavery. And that's the systematic removal of Black children from their homes has left an indelible mark on the psyche of Black mothers in this country. That this system is a constant conjuring of the historical traumas that the United States has inflicted upon them. And that if you ask the average Black person in Chicago how many of their neighbors were involved in the DCFS system, most would assume or say 50 to 60%. While Black children make up the majority of children in foster care in Chicago, they don't make the majority of Black children are not system involved. So we might ask, what does conjecture have to do with it? This speculation matters for many reasons, because however kindly intended, the foster care system is viewed as a lone main threat for most Black families. It is viewed as a state apparatus inflicted on the communities to control their behavior, and it does just that. That Black parenting becomes a constant display of qualification or defense, which is fight or flight. In public, we see this displayed as over gestures of discipline or care. For some, it becomes defensive, harsh words or spankings for the child to act right, because the people, the they, are always watching. And often we hear folks, elders and children use DCFS as a threat of punishment. The foster care system is not a boogeyman in most communities. It is something more visible, more visceral, something everyone knows is there, is present, and they imagine being the same thing. It's at every dinner table, every missed doctor's appointment, every stern word at the grocery store. It is a collective and trauma inflicted upon Black communities. And so parenting for Black folks becomes a trauma response. hyper-responsive to children's behaviors in public to avoid scrutinizing eyes. Parents avoid seeking medical attention for fear of having an overzealous doctor report. Homeless or unstably housed parents avoid registering their children for school to avoid nosy teachers. And the list can go on of services and resources that parents are denied because of their threat of the punishment if they want to be. And if we want to be more nuanced, we can talk about parents who experience substance abuse or misuse, avoiding treatment, or parents with mental health conditions avoiding therapy or other treatments for themselves or their children because the threat of losing their children is greater than the need for the services, because they have to weigh the threat of losing their children over the need for the services. That when we create a system made for surveillance and detection and not for aid and prevention, we lend ourselves to these outcomes. And that, and I can go on some more, not off of written, just about some anecdotal stories of parents who have a child who fell and broke their arm and avoided going to the hospital because they knew that would lead to a DCFS investigation. Parents who have a child whose mental health has created a hostile environment in the home and avoid going to DCFS for fear of having the child removed, avoid going to psychiatry or therapy because they don't want, because their parenting will it becomes criminalized, right? And so I think that the only way that parents are able to then, that when the system empowers everyone around you to surveil you and your parenting, then everybody becomes the enemy, right? And so it's hard to then parent. Parenting is just, your parenting is always on display and is always being criminalized, and that parents also feel the weight of that.
Thank you for starting us off, Charity. I'm wondering if any panelists have responses or things they'd like to build on that Charity mentioned in either her statement or her response afterward.
I think that's so powerful. And I think the one thing that I would add to that is that what I've seen is in some communities, when we talk about how they're viewed, many people don't even know who the mandated reporters are, right? And so I think the other side of that lens is that the reality that people are being policed in ways that they don't even know that they're being policed, right? They think oftentimes that the people who are reporting on them and coming to take their children are really just the Department of Social Services, but they don't realize that it's so woven into the fabric of their everyday marginalized life, that it is really just about everyone they come into contact with on a daily basis is someone who's possible mandated reporter. And so I think that on the other side of it, that's just as strong, the lack of knowledge about who could be possibly reporting on them and surveying them.
And, definitely the field of social work is absolutely in denial about the role that the field has historically played in this. The first juvenile courts were established by Jane Addams, who was, and this is not secret, it's not taught, but it's pretty known that, she was pretty racist and she was a eugenicist. And like some of my first classes, my first year, instructors will talk about, everyone thinks that we just take away people's kids. Well, that's because we frequently do, and because we created those systems for that to happen. And like, there's just like a lot of downplaying, or sometimes whenever there are these absolutely egregious cases of family separation, social workers won't admit our role in this. It's immediately, well, that person probably wasn't a social worker. They were just a caseworker and they didn't have a social work degree. So stop saying that social workers do this. So just like all of this like elitism and gatekeeping and denialism are just really not being addressed, even though on paper, the field of social work is trying to have these conversations around fighting racism. But in the end of the day, it's, you know, and I know the irony of being on a webinar, it's a lot of webinars, but not a whole lot of work, and the work needs to happen.
And I'll just add just one other piece, piggybacking off of Charity's beginning statements just around slavery. And I think about, you know, how parents protected their children because they didn't want their children to be seen. Because if they were seen in a way, you know, they were going to be used as labor or for sex. And so as Charity was outlining there that, you know, the need of protection and how families today have to adopt that. And so we have people in the public that take our need for protecting our families as a way that we are neglecting our families, but it's not founded in the belief and in the understanding of the trauma and the necessity to keep children out of sight to a certain extent, or else they will experience an incredible harm. And the woven injustices that are just seeped with mandated reporters, because I think that they lack a complete understanding of the need to protect our children.
I think that actually provides a good segue into thinking a little bit more about what does that look like throughout the system. And so I'm wondering if all of you, and maybe starting with Fallon, we could talk about how does mandated reporting actually impact families, starting from that call placed to DCFS all the way through family court and the proceedings that happen afterward. And I know this is something Tanya talked on, but a little bit more specifically from y'all's experiences would be great.
Yes, thank you, Molly. So I have a few different areas that I would like to touch on this specifically. What I find oftentimes in, when I say I mean in my work as a public defender, in my work in terms of organizing and working on policy reform, and then even as a professor, is that so many people, when I'm speaking to them about mandated reporting and policing or surveilling and Black and brown and marginalized communities, they don't even realize the extent of the impact, right? For them, it's all about preventing child abuse. And so they want to be precautionary. And when I speak to people who are mandated reporters, oftentimes speaking to students in social work schools, students in nursing schools, you know, students in med school. When I'm speaking to them, you know, teachers, all these sorts of people, they're like, oh, well, I didn't really know the ramifications of the report, right? I didn't know that when I made this report, this child was going to get removed. That wasn't my intention, right? I only did it because someone above me told me I needed to do it. I only did it because my training taught me this was the best thing to do, just to be on the safe side, that if nothing really was going wrong, then it would be fine for that child. It would be fine for that parent, for that family. These are good people. And I didn't mean to do this. I didn't notice that this was going to take on their lives. I think what that is doing is, the reality of what that shows me is that people don't recognize the sort of implicit and very much explicit racism and classism that is embedded in the system of mandated reporting in general, right? They don't recognize, these people who are making these reports, oftentimes, maybe they don't, or maybe they do recognize that in making these reports, depending on what that family makeup looks like, they're going to be investigated, right? That case is going to, the DSS, CPS is going to dig deeper into that family's history than they would in terms of a white or predominantly middle or wealthy class family, right? And then in the first place, that if we were talking about predominantly middle class or wealthy white families, these reports wouldn't be made, right? And so that recognizing that bias in and of itself. So I think that's the first part of it, is that, you know, people have to understand the ramifications that this report has. It's not just the idea that a report is made, someone is going to, you know, file it away. They are going to investigate. And oftentimes this can open up a can of worms for other people and for these people's lives, right? And so then I want to talk about the second part of it, is like, what does this actually look like? Well, you know, in most jurisdictions, so now I practice in 3 jurisdictions, North Carolina, I've, you know, seen the child welfare system in Virginia, and then also in New York. And most jurisdictions, what's going to happen is once that report is made, a investigator will go out, a CPS investigator, and they will start to decide whether or not there's some evidence to confirm the allegations that were made in that report. And while they're doing their investigation, they have the right to ask to speak to any of your relatives, any of your neighbors. When you're living in inner cities, you have these workers going and knocking door to door to speak to people. They ask parents oftentimes to sign releases, blank releases, for all of their confidential information, for all of the confidential information of their children. They oftentimes don't explain the ramifications of that. They ask them to submit to toxicologies. They do these sort of get to know you questionnaires where they're really just digging for more information to use against them, right? Asking about past trauma and abuse and mental illness and mental health, under the guise of seeking to help them, right? Because the reality is, if they confirm any of these sorts of things, then the requirement is going to be, whether they decide to file a petition alleging that they abused or neglected their child or not, the requirement is going to be that they engage in these services to address these issues now in the community. And what we have then is, if parents say, oh, I don't want to do those services, like, I'm fine, then it's, oh, you have poor judgment, right? And you're putting your child at risk because you're not engaging in these services. That's not even taking into account the fact of the matter that many of these families, parents, especially in severely marginalized communities, and I would say, based off of my representation in New York, where you have so many families who we would come into contact with representing them as parents who were also in the child welfare system themselves, right? They were also in foster care. And what we do know is that most children who are going into foster care have some sort of mental health evaluation completed and some sort of diagnosis, right? And so now at 25, they're being charged with neglect for not following up on whatever diagnosis was made while they were in foster care. It's a repetitive cycle. And so I think that leads me to my third point, which is that we have to recognize how these reports can lead to sort of generational child welfare involvement, right? I believe Dorothy Roberts talks about disintegration of the family. And it starts with that initial report. And why do I say it starts with the initial report? Because, like I said, it really doesn't matter in most jurisdictions whether this report ever makes it to court. Right. What we know is that it's actually so harmful because most reports don't make it to court, and people are being supervised and under the authority of the state without any sort of judicial intervention in the community. Right. So they're being mandated to do things. I've seen in Virginia where parents have been told that they have to allow other people to care for their children, and they're under these sort of social contracts with the state that have no judicial oversight. Right. And then the other impact that it could have on them is that creates this sort of generational cycle of child welfare involvement is that, say the department decides that they don't have enough evidence and they make the report unfounded, right? Or say they think they have some credible evidence of it, but it's not enough that they want to file a petition for abuse and neglect, and they're going to indicate the report and keep it on file. There are jurisdictions where those reports can remain on file for 10 years after a child's 18th birthday, meaning that if that parent has an infant, that report can remain on file now for 28 years, right? What kind of impact does that have on marginalized communities? Well, it means that many of the jobs that are most accessible to them, I'm talking about Head Start, daycare, I'm talking about bus drivers, security officers, working as teachers in schools, working as coaches, doing those sorts of activities, working in housing, those are not going to be accessible to them because generally when someone has a report on file, even if it's indicated and there was no actual finding of abuse or neglect, that could prevent them from working in any capacity with children. Right. And so we see that the impacts are much broader and much larger than just sort of that initial investigation. It can have a long lasting generational impacts on the family.
And, a lot of times the field of social work is coming from the assumption that social workers are never involved in these systems ourselves, which indicates quite a few things. None of them are good. But like there's been a more high profile case of a woman in Texas who is a social work student at University of Texas, Arlington, Brianna Bauckham, who is a social work student and has been the victim of constant harassment of people filing child protective claims to the point where she has lost custody of her daughter and is fighting to get custody back, and is facing a significant amount of harassment from UTA police. And so, these systems do also harm, other workers. And, we need more Brianna Bachams in the field. We need more people who've had these interactions and experiences. And when, we have these policies that make it so that any of this will come up in a background check, it perpetuates these systems where the, so-called care workers do not have any background or experience, and thus continue all of this harm.
And I wanted to join Fallon in talking about the savior complex that a lot of folks have when they make these calls. And one of the young people I work with likened it to Superman coming in and saving somebody and then throwing them in a, like a lava pit and flying away, as if they saved the day. And I think that is very much what happens when folks make a call, is that our imaginations, similar to when folks call the police, is our imaginations are so stifled about what is possible and how we can intervene and also respond to young people in crisis, is that we're often that the first thing we're presented with, or the first thing we go to, is the foster care system. We're making these reports, and that what happens in that process is that the same young people who we who are deemed as vulnerable and maltreated are then once they become system involved are then categorized as at risk and then subsequently criminalized. And so their vulnerability disappears once they become system involved, because then there's no more systems, there's nothing else that we can do. So there's no more interventions, there's no more state interruption, because the state is the disruption now. The state is the problem, and where do you go from there? And so I had not a friend, someone I know who had a student come into school who was often wasn't wearing the proper clothes. It was very clear that they were going through a hard time, and called DCFS, and DCFS got involved and reported back that, oh, the kid was already DCFS involved. And so there's no other, movement that you can make from that point. And so then how then do you save? How then do you rescue, right? And where do your sort of Superman wings go from there? And I think that's often, part of the job that we are presented with in thinking is that how do we create a radical imagination around how do we disrupt and interrupt systems? How do we give folks, well, I think we're gonna get to that later, but yeah, I think the sort of that when you create a system that that Tanya talked about early, which is founded by white savior complex, is that you are often presented with white savior ideas.
Just going to provide a really short answer. And I was thinking about here in Washington State, our intake line is 1-800-END-HARM. And the language right from that moment says that you are showing up, that you're going to stop the harm that's going on for families. There's this assumption that there's harm happening for families. And I think that puts in everyone's mind that they have to come in and swoop in and do something for this family. Families are not in harm, they are in crisis to some extent, or they're experiencing impacts from poverty and other variables that might be outside of even poverty. And so, when you make that call and you dial that number and you come up with DCFS, or here we call them DCYF, when they enter into the home, they start off with the premise of there's something bad going on in here. It's not looking for strengths. It's not looking for what's going right. If the call has been made, there has to be something wrong. And I'm hoping that as we continue this conversation, that we recognize that families have strengths, that they are innately, they have the ability to solve problems with the proper supports and resources, comparably to this interrogation that puts you on the defensive. It doesn't keep you open to possibilities because you're now in a state of protection. As you get into that state of protection, your ability to be forthright with information becomes minimal. And then that once again becomes a barrier and plays negatively on how you're seen and how you're cooperating. So those are some of my thoughts.
I appreciate you saying that, Shrounda, because I think we do want to pivot there at some point and really home in on families and how they're doing and what this would look like for them. But before we pivot that way, I want to hit on something that Fallon brought up, which is just this idea that some mandated reporters really are making hotline calls because they're fearful of their own liability, their own loss of licensure, what's being held over their head and what they don't know what happens afterward. And I saw a question about COVID come in through the Q&A, and I think it's important to note that that sort of fear hasn't gone away with so many things going remote due to coronavirus. And it's something actually that in Illinois, at least, the media has picked up on and even amplified. So I'm thinking about a letter that we know DCFS sent out to Illinois teachers, reminding them to report concerns as stay-at-home orders ramped up. And I'm thinking about also what Shrounda just said about some families being in crisis, even in their own homes. And so I'm wondering what virtual access into homes means for families and communities when it comes to mandated reporters being able to zoom in to where young people are living and trying to survive and trying to go about their daily life. So I don't know who wants to start off with this, Charity. If you want to, or if somebody else wants to jump in, please feel free.
Well, I just want to start off once again and piggyback off of the notion that there's harm. Right, that you've got to have a heightened awareness, like you are infusing into people's belief, right? That you've got to go in and be looking for things. Because children are home does not mean that they are not doing well. And what Tanya's data had shown early on is that the majority of the calls never needed to be made in the first place. And so we need to really be clear that, you know, when we infuse that type of thinking into our community members, they respond, right? So now they're going in and they're looking for things that aren't necessarily there. So I think that the language, the way that people present the information starts to create a trajectory that is extremely problematic and harmful for families.
I would just add there, I would just piggyback on that and say that I've been in a couple of strategic planning meetings statewide in Virginia, and the focus is 100% on finding and stopping child abuse or neglect, right? You know, they have talked about ways in which to increase home access, right? Not home access in terms of, you know, allowing for more visits possibly between children who are in foster care, who are maybe with other kinship placements and their parents, or moving towards reunification efforts. But what they're really talking about is increasing the number of people who has access to put eyes on the family. And so what I even saw was that in one school district, they have spent a large amount, the city has spent a large amount of money on busing to provide meals during COVID, right? Because this is during the time, they really just wanted to put more eyes on the children to make sure that they were okay. And what they found is that most children were not utilizing the meals. And then when I was in a statewide meeting, they said, well, we wonder why that is, or why aren't these families who are living in these marginalized communities not accessing the meals that their children would normally have access to. And I raised the idea of maybe it's perhaps because they receive emergency funds during COVID, right? They received emergency funds, you know, food subsidy, and was able to actually provide for their family just fine without having an additional set of eyes come to their home, right? another example is the increase in in-home nursing services and visiting nurse services, right? There's a lot of money funneled towards that in the state of Virginia, and just to have a set of eyes on these families and to ensure that they're doing okay. I don't believe that many stakeholders right now, especially in mandated reporting and the mandated reporting role, are really thinking about the idea that if we actually do what initially happened during COVID, and I'm not saying that I'm not by any means saying that this happened on a widespread in a widespread sort of way, right? That we gave a lot of money to marginalized communities. That's not what happened. What I am saying is that where we saw people were giving actual resources, financial and food resources, giving insurance, access to healthcare, healthcare, that the need for additional welfare programs or people per se to come into their homes decreased. And I just don't believe the data supports that, that during COVID, during this pandemic, there was any increase whatsoever in abuse and neglect cases.
And, just going off of what Fallon just said, the entire field of social services breaks its collective brain around why aren't people using our absolutely amazing service? We need to get our money, we need to get these numbers up because that's what the funder wants, or that's what a policymaker wants, or that's what a stakeholder wants. It actually happened at my internship last year. Prior to COVID, there was concerns that the number of people accessing pantry services had decreased. And, and this could have been framed in so many different ways. And the way that it was framed on me was, you need to start contacting people and ask why they're not using this program. And like a lot of it had to do with this fear of, if less people use this service, that makes the agency look bad. When what Fallon is speaking to is, sometimes that's not the needed service. And many times some of these services do very much get weaponized in ways that are surveillance.
I think actually that would be a great way to talk a little bit about that weaponization and what these systems really look like in the current context societally as well. So thinking about the foster system, where does it fit into the conversations that are being had about the system or systems that you all are working within, or that you see as intersectional and related to the work that you do? That could include current conversations about race, racial justice, socioeconomic justice, anything that is happening around those systems. Does anything come to mind for anyone?
Yes. So, I think that in coming to this work as sort of a student of intersectionality and looking for places in which there are intersections, the one thing that I have really tried to not only teach my students, but work in terms of the spaces that I'm working in the community, is to understand how I don't even want to say that it's interconnected, that, racism and classism, those sorts of things are that's intersectional as it relates to the child welfare system. The child welfare system itself is an infrastructure that is built out of white supremacy. And I think that once we get more comfortable starting from that notion of how this system is built, we'll be more comfortable with sort of figuring out solutions to the child welfare system, right? We cannot continue to say that we're perpetuating a system that is beneficial to families and beneficial to marginalized communities. That's not what's happening, right? I was just actually doing a lecture yesterday where I, talked with my students about mandated reporting, policing, and surveillance, and how that has largely, how Tanya talked about earlier, and her overview of this system and the historical overview, but like largely looking at that system from a Jim Crow standpoint, right? And thinking about how that correlates with mass incarceration. All of those systems are the foundation for what the child welfare system is in and of itself. And so if we want to actually address the issues as it relates to policing, and specifically through mandated reporters as state actors, then we need to actually address the issue, the elephant in the room, which is that it is a racist system, and start from there.
And like I will say, as a social work student right now, when these conversations around mandated reporting come up, it's, you know, here's the federal law, here's what you do in Illinois, here's every horrible thing that will happen to you personally when you don't report, because when you don't report, the absolute worst case scenario thing will happen, and you will get into these 5 million versions of trouble, including loss of licensure. And in my human behavior and social environment class, like, we didn't bring up, some of the fact that like statutes around neglect are very vague and can really punish families. That only came up because like students raised their hands and brought that up in the class organically. And the other thing, looking at, the history of racism within social work, like many programs, including mine, talk about racial justice and are, doing different projects around racial justice, or are talking about DEI, but also like they're not really changing the structure of the program, which is you have to have unpaid internships for 1 to 2 years. You have to be enrolled in classes, and there's not a whole lot of funding. So this, you're taking out loans. So it's still basically maintaining a system where most of these social workers are white women. And, the things that you hear is, well, we can't end our relationship with some of our internship sites that do involve people in not in carceral forms of treatment, or we can't find the funding to pay interns. So it's like like a lot of times it's talking around the problem and not doing, material things to really address any of this, because, there's no way to do this that isn't going to upset stakeholders, and no one's at a point where they are confident enough to upset all of the stakeholders. And that's phenomenally frustrating, especially because like the low wages in the field and the punitiveness of these laws are absolutely connected, because, of the thing that, Fallon has spoken to of, people fear that if they don't do this, they will get into a whole lot of trouble. We need to be thinking about like mass non-compliance with these oppressive systems. And that's not where education and law and social work and healthcare are thinking. No one is really pushing for that. Everyone just wants, everyone wants things to keep on moving without challenging any of this at all.
I'll just add one other piece on here, and really, I'm really seeking justice for children. I mean, we frame this in a way that these children go into these homes and into the system and they fare far better. They do not. They are incredibly harmed in other people's homes. It is a sex trafficking pathway. The abuse, the trauma, the lack of knowing, the lack of identity. So, the call for justice that I'm asking for is, this isn't fair to kids. This isn't right for them. They have homes and communities and members that are love them and are vested in their well-being and their overall success in the world. And so I think it's so important that when we have this conversation that we really call it out, right? Like, we have this idea that you're heading over to foster care and you are far better off. Nothing is further from the truth. So the justice is, no longer are we going to say this no longer are we going to be in a state of denial of what's actually occurring in the homes of strangers, because you're taking children out of their homes and putting them with strangers and saying, we believe you'll be far better because, and here's the other kind of because piece is, we've licensed you, right? You've passed a couple of our tests. And from here we can, wipe our heads and say, we've done good. You haven't. And the outcomes for these children are dismal and appalling. So my justice plea is, please stop putting children in these positions to have, to fend for themselves. If you talk to foster youth, they'll give you some really great information. And what they'll tell you is, I hated being a foster child. I hated not being with my family. I couldn't understand why my mama wasn't able to get me back. And what they can't understand is the system wouldn't give you back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think this current movement to talking about defunding the police is an important area to think about. How do we reframe? I think a lot of people brilliantly did it when folks start calling for the defunding of police, and people's response was social workers can do it. And then some folks, not a lot of people, right? But some people did it really brilliantly by calling and naming social work as also a form of policing. And so what how I like to think about and enter this conversation is that Dorothy Roberts wrote a piece on the criminalization of Black motherhood. And so when I first started doing this work, I wondered why folks weren't talking about abolition of foster care the same way that we talk about prisons, right? Why we don't have the same conversations about why this isn't a part of that conversation, that we know that they have, that there's connections there, right? And it's so much about whose body the system lands on, and that it disproportionately lands on Black women. And so that it's very easy to skip this conversation over and to believe the narrative of protecting Black children from Black mothers, because we haven't challenged, we as a society and even as a movement haven't challenged those ideas, that we would like to that we can believe that there is that there's a different way to think about and to address the mass inequities that exist inside of the prison system, but we can't believe the same thing about foster care system. And so I think as a current movement that we and I would say non-Black women need to push ourselves further to think about the narratives that we hold on to and talking about abolition and prison justice and all of these other things. And also defunding and that we can't just talk about decriminalizing. We can't just talk about decriminalizing the things that impact other bodies without also talking about these things that decriminalizing parenting is important, and that its impacts are great.
That is actually exactly where I think we went ahead at this point, is thinking about that abolition or removing power from the system as it is right now. And this goes back to what Shrounda brought up earlier, that, you know, we're talking about how these systems are not helping. They are harmful systems in terms of outcomes for families, for communities, especially poor families, Black families, Indigenous families. And so I want to kind of ask a two-parter here before we open up questions from the audience. First of all, what does it look like for families to be able to seek support without fear of punitive system involvement? But then also, what does it look like to get there? So what are some of your thoughts on how do we get to that point where people are no longer fearful of either using the support and the strength that they already have, or of seeking it out somewhere where they might not be punished for those things? Shrounda, I don't know if you want to start since you brought it up earlier.
Yeah,
Great.
yeah. First of all, I just want to kind of ground this in is that asking for help is a strength, it's not a weakness. And the way that the system is set up is that it, if you need something, there's something wrong with you, and it approaches you from that standpoint from the get-go. Most of the services that DCYF connects you to are already in your community. You know, you're able to access them with Medicaid. I don't necessarily need a system in place to get me to drug treatment, to get me to mental health. The issues around poverty, they don't even address, right? So, if we know that a large percent of families are coming into poverty related and we're entering them into a system that cannot answer that. They're not designed to answer poverty. They come up with a long list of services that you need to jump through, and the core problem is never even touched. So I'm actually going to tell you, we need to have far more community involvement and mobilization around creating centers that can answer those calls, that can get people to where they need to get to. I think that the information is what is evasive at some points. And so these, I think hubs of some sort, resource centers that actually house a large percentage of the information needed. I think about that if I am in poverty related situations, right, that, the more accessible things are, the more likely I'm going to be able to assess them, right? So we need to be intentional about how we are placing supports into systems. Our investment needs to not be in foster care because the investment doesn't yield you very much on your return, other than you might, have a sigh of relief for a moment. And that's because, in my opinion, you don't have the full picture. So I'm thinking that the more that we remove children actually going into systems, and we remove the transactional piece, because I don't think we've talked enough about that today too, is that there's a transactional that happens when children go into child welfare, right? We don't have money coming to states for reunification, but we do have money coming for states for adoption, right? We want to remove the motivation of keeping children inside of this system. So my position is that, we need to have far more community supports. We need to have campaigns that inform those. We need to have targeted efforts that are going into communities that have high concentration rates of child welfare, and really going and bringing them what they need. If we understand that the root cause of poverty is, we need to be really focused on that. And I don't think we do enough of that. I think that we do a lot of blaming and shaming of parents so that we don't have to really get down to the root of the issues, which is this nation has been founded on oppression, and it has continued on for generation to generation, and that there is now a new dress on an old situation that has been in operation in the United States since it's been founded. So what I just believe is that we shouldn't have to wait for families to get to crisis. The system is not the answer. And while, you shouldn't be able to, the system to me is not the answer for the majority of the issues that are coming up for families. It's just not. So we need to stop putting that idea that that's the place to go for resolve. That's the place to go for trauma, for family separation, for children that end up in dismal places. That's what happens for families when they go into that system, for the most part.
And, I really want to affirm, what Charity has said. The field of social work has got to clean out its house. And the many social workers that are talking about, well, just have more school social workers, have more social workers handling crisis situations, really have to reckon with all of the cop stuff that's in our field. And it's not just, our role in family regulation. Our blue wall of silence is written in our code of ethics. You can be disciplined if you engage in unwarranted negative criticism of your colleagues. And so while the field of social work is saying we need to address our historic role in racism, and yet you have a rule that's okay, everyone use nice words, we're not actually going to get to the bottom of all of this. And, it may mean that social work radically changes, or the current credentialized, professionalized forms of community care, which people see as the beginning of social work, maybe that needs to go. And to just think, that there have always been people in communities since, written history, that we're connecting people to services, and we're helping resolve community disputes, and we're being leaders, that we're absolutely doing the work of social work. And I just like to think that, a lot of what I do in Social Service Workers United is helping organize social workers to really challenge these systems. So we're looking at collective liberation and not willing partners in coercive forms of social control. And this is going to hurt feelings. It's going to possibly lead to some sanctions or consequences, and it will be worth it if we are able to end this harm and create, what Shrounda is talking about, communities of space and healing and support, and not trauma.
Molly, I would like to answer both parts of that. I think the one part and the question that you asked was like sort of what could it look like for people to seek assistance that's not punitive, right? And I think I am not denying the fact that marginalized communities, especially ones ravaged by poverty, are in need oftentimes of assistance due to crises that are related to being in poverty, right? But I think something that we also have to recognize is that the idea right now as it stands in the child welfare system of how we provide services is seen through a lens of the dominant culture perspective, which is white parenting and what is the norm or what is the ideal, right? And I think if we stop trying to hold people to that unrealistic notion of what parenting is, it doesn't take into consideration race, it doesn't take into consideration class, and it doesn't take into consideration the cultures and the religions that our communities are embodying, right? And so I think that's one way. And then I think the second thing is, especially when I'm in a lot of these circles, strategic meetings, talking about how we're going to get money from the state budget. And I'm going to get into this in the second part of my answer. But a lot of the times what I am told when I'm saying, we just need to give money to communities, right? We need to trust communities to know what sort of resources they need and to be of resource to each other, right? And that allows us to trust them. The system doesn't trust these communities. It doesn't trust Black and brown families, right? It very much, paternalizes and infantilizes, I cannot say the word right now, infantilization, right, of these communities, right? And so ways to get away from that, I think, one of the models that I'm often that's often thrown at me is, well, it has to be trauma informed. We can, give money to these organizations, we can support these communities so long as they're doing trauma informed work. And I think that really takes away from the idea that these communities have been doing work amongst themselves for, years. And that work hasn't been trauma informed through a social work lens, right? And then I guess when we're talking about the sort of what could reimagining, what could an alternative look like, right? I think an alternative that really goes away from this white savior complex is like the idea that we stop creating social work dependent communities, right? That we actually funnel money in to allow these communities to build and invest in themselves, to create generational wealth amongst themselves, to be able to sort of provide job opportunities, the educational resources they need, business opportunities, grants, ways for them to, better themselves. And when we're talking about people are constantly in a cycle of working for $7.50 an hour for minimum wage, that's continuing to create that sort of generational poverty cycle. And so, and the last part of that, I think, is thinking about what can we do to empower these communities to challenge the system as it is, right? A lot of this is all of us going in as actors outside of these communities and saying we want to help you, but how can we empower these communities to challenge the system themselves? And I think the way in which we do that is through coalition work and coalition building, not inserting ourselves as the leaders in that movement, but as partners with people who are having the lived experiences in the child welfare system, having lived experiences being policed and surveyed and living in marginalized communities. And we can do that through, legislative policy change and reform, and, really working on the issues that are affecting them and getting the people who are making these decisions on behalf of these communities to stop and to allow people who are affected to be at the table and be a part of the conversation and the decision-making process.
And I would say that, yes, I agree. And that really to reduce the need for services and resources, right? And so it means a mass redistribution of wealth, that we could cut down the number of cases that go into, that get reported to DCFS by eliminating poverty, right? Like 70–80% of them are due to poverty, due to like folks' need for resources. And so that's a big goal dream, right? And I think the middle road of it is by going back to what DCFS or CPS or any of its iterations were before Black people were, before they treated Black folks, right? So in the mid 60s and 70s, before Black folks were allowed to access foster care services, when it was the majority of folks engaged in the foster care system were white women, that it operated completely different, similar to food stamps, right? Before Black folks were allowed access to it, it operated different. And so before that, right, that people could, when they were experiencing, when they were overwhelmed because parenting is hard, right? Or when they didn't have resources, they were out of a job, they could drop their kids off. They could like do what is basically self-report, right? And the agency or the system would take that child in, give the parents resources, and they would be able to come back, no questions asked, to pick their child back up, right? And that changed when Black children and Black folks engaged, when the system decided that Black folks, they needed to engage Black folks in that same system. That the way that the system responded to need changed, and the way that it responded to parents changed. And so I think, yeah, that if we look at historically how the system operated when it excluded Black people, that is a intermediary goal.
And just, to add on to what Charity's talking about, this historical context, the same time that all of that is going on, the APA deliberately changed the diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia and bipolar disorder to add language including aggression and paranoia and delusions. And specifically, then that change in the diagnosis, that diagnosis was used to pathologize Black activists as part of the Black Power movement. So you have, the pathologizing of the Black community and the change in services for services to be more punitive are absolutely linked. And the DSM is what social workers are required to use if they're doing any kind of mental health treatment for insurance reimbursement. So like this change is going to really involve looking at that historical context and creating something very radically different.
All right, there is so much there. I feel like I could listen to y'all go back and forth and build on each other all day. We are getting so many questions coming in from the audience, and we are coming up to our 90-minute mark. And so I want to try to get at least a couple of them in and see if folks want to respond to any of them. And several of the questions are really centering around how do we make this change, right? And who is leading the change? And I know this was touched on in terms of following the folks who are impacted and already having these conversations. But there's a lot of people who are viewing today who are saying they're feeling overwhelmed, they're feeling frustrated because they are part of these systems and not finding very many people to align themselves with to demand change. And so I think they're asking generally, do panelists know of people who are in positions of power within systems of social work, like the child welfare system, or in education, or really in the legislative bodies as well, who are realizing how racist these systems are, and what does it look like to work with and support them as well?
There's a lot of organizing that has been ongoing, and a lot of it is region-based. There is a group of social service workers in New York that Social Service Workers Uprising Now, that is doing a lot of organizing work specifically with an anti-oppressive lens, that does have a mandated reporter working group that is looking at how to educate other mandated reporters on, connecting families to services instead of making calls to ACS. There's Social Service Workers United in Chicago, which is doing similar organizing work so that people are empowered enough in their workplaces that they can challenge these oppressive things without risking employment. There's Boston Liberation Health Group, which is in Boston, which is really focused on anti-oppressive clinical work. And like a lot of it, like I'm mentioning groups rather than individuals, because like a lot of it is more of like group efforts. The individuals that come to mind, Dr. Ellen Detloff, who is the Dean of the University of Houston's program, social work program, is doing a lot of work demanding the abolition of the child welfare system through the Upend movement. But it's a lot of, you'll find like a lot more collectives and groups rather than individuals, just because, the nature of social work is very punitive against people who challenge these things, unfortunately.
And I'll just say, as a parent with lived experience, the movement itself of having lived experience at the table, helping to inform practice and policy, is definitely moving pretty exponentially through the nation. So I would encourage you to, the Birth Parent National Network does a lot of national work around mobilizing that voice. I'm doing work with the Institute for Families, which is out of North Carolina, which is doing a series on the unlearning of child welfare. Casey Family, and actually the Children's Bureau, or it might be Annie Casey, I'm not sure, is doing working on approaches around a child well-being system. I think that there's a lot of conversation and motivation. The data does not lie. It tells a very, very clear story. And I think that the more that you're bringing those experiences so that you can hear the truth from those that you believe you were helping, and they will tell you something completely counter, will continue to kind of help motivate and generate a movement that certainly feels like it's in full swing. So I think that you just need to do a little bit of looking around the coalition building. There's a rewiring effort with Children's Home Society. There's a lot of conversation on this subject going forward.
The other person I wanted to mention would be Joyce McMillan and the work Joyce is doing with the Movement for Family Power. So as an organization that's being led by someone that was directly impacted by the family regulation system.
Excellent, thank you so much. And actually Movement for Family Power will be participating in one of our future webinars in this series. So I'm sure that they very much align with a lot that has been shared today. One other thing that I feel like is coming up a little bit in the Q&A, and we don't have a ton of time for it, but I think people are still wondering we're talking about future systems and what those look like, but what does it look like in the now for people who are encountering instances where they are concerned about a child's well-being, but they're mindful of the system in which those concerns are rooted, right? And what happens after if they report them. So does anyone have thoughts on how one might approach that when they encounter it?
Myself and a group of students at UIC Jane Addams are working as part of a task force group, and we're creating a resource guide that's called Before You Call DCFS. that breaks down like some of the history around mandated reporting laws, why they cause harm, some of the data that shows the disproportionality in overreporting in Black families and the underreporting of serious maltreatment in white families, and then breaks down the statutes in ANCRA that show like these definitions of neglect are ignoring the basic needs, and that there are some biases that can drive calls. And we include some Chicago and Illinois specific resources, and with some feedback from some other stakeholders and groups, like talking through, if you really think you have to call, inform the family of their rights, or as Tanya mentioned, their lack of rights. Make sure that the person you're speaking to is repeating back information accurately. Mention the family's strengths, involve the family when you call, and continue to provide advocacy and support. But that's the very last page. And before you get to that, you get to everything that's concerning about these laws and resources you can directly contact first. And we've also been in touch with a group of folks in New York doing similar work that are doing, creating a version that's New York specific. And that's really like the thing that I've been seeing is, groups of mandated reporters having to literally create our own systems of information because lawmakers are refusing to really act on or address any of this.
I'll say something extremely short. If you care enough to call, you should be care enough to get involved. Sometimes you can ask the most simplest questions to get to the resolve for families. We have this notion that if we pass off to someone else, we've done our due diligence. That is not the case. Sometimes and a lot of times the just mere act of caring enough to kind of have those conversations can generate solutions between both parties that are involved in the dialogue with each other. I think the greatest resource is human resource. I think that we are the answers for each other. We need to really be stepping into that place instead of passing off to someone else. So I think that a lot more answers are right there in front of you, sitting down, getting in front of the computer, figuring out what those resources are. Sometimes you might even have to throw out a couple bucks out of your own pocket. But I think that the investment, the very small token, can yield some amazing results of not, thrusting families into this very, very damaging system that creates far more harm than does good.
Any final thoughts from anyone else before we close out? We only have a couple minutes here. All right.
I would just say, sorry, I would just say really quickly that, I think a lot of people have been asking, and I'm just looking in the Q&A about, what are ways that we can get involved? What are ways that we can get involved? I work at an organization. I'm a social worker. I'm a person who's affected. I do all these sorts of things. If you are like me and you are a person who finds yourself in that system, and you find yourself perpetuating that system, and you're probably tormented by it, that was me. That's me. When I was at, Bronx Defenders in New York, I looked for people who were doing the work, right? And not necessarily to be a leader in that, but to learn from people who were doing the work. I needed to learn how to work in coalition with people. I needed to learn how to work with people who were, doing policy work, who were doing legislative advocacy reform work. I had to teach myself something new. Because I felt like that was where the change was going to happen at. And then in working community with those people, we were able to form a coalition of different providers, of people who were affected, of, people coming at this from different walks of life. And I think, if the question is how, I think be introspective and then, just do the work to start moving, right?
All right, thank you so much for adding that in, Fallon. And with that, I just want to thank all four of our incredible panelists for this conversation today. I hope that you are leaving with resources, with understanding, and with hopefully more questions that you continue to dig into and engage with as you do the work. We have some information on the slide if you'd like to follow along with the work that any of our panelists are doing, either individually or with organizations and coalitions. We are getting a lot of questions about the resource guide. We're getting questions about some of the links that people mentioned or the organizations that people mentioned and uplifted. And so if you do have individual questions, you can definitely reach out to the folks who are on the screen. Please also consider joining us for our third of the fourth in this series, which is going to be on Wednesday, December 9th, and we'll focus on the criminal legal systems and the foster system and how those interact and parallel each other, which will build really well on this conversation today. So thank you all again for joining us, and we hope to see you next month.